The law can take a child away in less than 5 minutes, but sometimes it takes one honest person to give that child a future again. The old courtroom clock clicked with relentless precision, each second echoing louder than the whispers filling courtroom 4B at the Franklin County Family Justice Center in Columbus, Ohio. Rain streaked across the tall windows, turning the afternoon light into a dull gray haze that settled over polished wooden benches and tired faces. Nia Brooks stood alone at the defense table, her hands clasped so tightly the edges of her worn sweater trembled between her fingers. At 32, she had learned how to survive on little sleep, cheap coffee, and determination, but nothing had prepared her for the silence that came before a judge changed a child's life forever. Across the room, her 7-year-old son, Elijah, swung his legs beneath a chair that seemed much too large for him. His small backpack rested beside his sneakers, the blue fabric faded from years of use, a tiny astronaut keychain hanging from the zipper. He looked toward his mother every few seconds with the kind of trust only children possess, believing adults always knew how stories ended. Nia forced herself to smile each time he looked her way, even though the fear inside her had already settled like cold stone. She had worked double shifts at a nursing home for almost 3 years. She had skipped meals so Elijah could have fresh fruit in his lunchbox. She had walked nearly 2 miles home more than once after missing the last bus, because overtime meant another hour of electricity or another week of rent. None of those sacrifices appeared anywhere inside the thick stack of legal papers resting on the judge's bench. Those pages only listed missed appointments caused by broken transportation, late school pickups caused by mandatory overtime, and anonymous complaints that painted a picture of neglect she barely recognized. Her former husband, Marcus Brooks, sat quietly beside his attorney. He wore an expensive navy suit and kept his expression carefully neutral, almost sympathetic. To anyone watching, he looked like a father simply asking for stability. No one could see the months of carefully organized documents, the paid evaluations, or the carefully timed accusations that had slowly turned Nia's hardest years into evidence against her. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the final page before him. His voice remained calm, almost mechanical. After reviewing the evidence presented before this court, temporary primary custody will be awarded to the father pending further evaluation. The words landed without anger or drama. They simply existed, final and immovable. Nia blinked once, certain she had misunderstood. Then Elijah's voice broke through the heavy silence. "Mom." It was only one word, barely louder than a whisper, but it carried more fear than anything spoken that afternoon. Nia stepped forward instinctively, only for a court officer to gently raise a hand, signaling her to remain where she was until the paperwork was completed. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat and nodded, refusing to let Elijah see panic on her face. "It's okay, baby," she said softly, though the words scraped against her chest. "Just listen for a minute." Elijah stood slowly, clutching one strap of his backpack. Confusion clouded his young face as he looked from his mother to strangers who suddenly seemed to be making decisions about his life. "Am I going home with you after this?" he asked. No one answered immediately. Even Marcus lowered his eyes. Somewhere behind the rows of spectators, a chair shifted quietly. A tall man in a charcoal suit remained seated in the very last row, his posture perfectly still, his attention fixed not on Nia or Marcus, but on the judge himself. His silver watch reflected a brief flash of gray daylight before disappearing beneath his cuff. Few people in the courtroom noticed him. Those who did instinctively avoided staring for long. Beside him, a woman carrying a leather portfolio leaned closer and spoke almost under her breath. "Sir, should we intervene?" The man never looked away from the bench. His voice was calm, steady, and unexpectedly gentle. "Not yet." The woman hesitated. "If we wait much longer." "Truth has a habit of revealing itself," he replied quietly. "If we move too early, they'll bury it deeper." At the front of the courtroom, Elijah finally let go of his backpack and ran the few steps separating him from his mother. He wrapped both arms around her waist with all the strength a frightened 7-year-old could find. Nia dropped to her knees and held him tightly, pressing her cheek against his curls as she struggled to keep her breathing steady. "I'll come back for you," she whispered into his ear. "I don't care how long it takes. I promise." Elijah nodded against her shoulder because children still believe promises could fix impossible things. The man in the last row watched the embrace without expression, but his hand slowly closed around a plain black folder resting on his lap. On its cover, embossed in small silver letters almost invisible beneath the dim courtroom lights, were 6 words that no one else in the room could read. Office of Judicial Oversight and Ethics. Nia did not remember walking out of the courthouse. She only remembered the weight of Elijah's backpack still hanging from her shoulder long after he had been driven away with his father. The tiny astronaut keychain tapped softly against her arm with every step, a gentle sound that somehow hurt more than the judge's ruling. Outside, the steady Ohio rain had turned into a cold drizzle, coating the courthouse steps in a silver sheen as attorneys hurried toward waiting cars and families quietly disappeared into their separate lives. No one noticed the woman standing motionless beneath the stone columns, staring at the empty parking space where the sedan carrying her son had vanished only minutes earlier. Across the street, inside a black luxury sedan parked beneath an old maple tree, Malcolm Carter remained seated without starting the engine. Through the rain-speckled windshield, he watched Nia from a distance, not with pity but with careful attention. Beside him, his chief legal advisor, Evelyn Price, closed the leather portfolio resting on her lap. She had worked with Malcolm for nearly 12 years and knew the expression on his face well enough to recognize that he had already made a decision long before speaking it aloud. "The order is signed," she said quietly. "If we open an investigation today, the media will accuse your office of interfering with an active custody case." Malcolm kept his eyes on the courthouse entrance. "That is exactly why we will not touch the custody order." Evelyn frowned slightly. "Then what are we investigating?" Malcolm answered without hesitation. "The process that produced it." Silence settled between them for several moments. Rain tapped steadily against the roof while courthouse employees locked side entrances one by one. Finally, Malcolm reached for the black folder resting beside him and opened it. Inside were photographs, judicial performance reports, anonymous ethics complaints, and financial disclosures collected over nearly 8 months. Judge Harold Whitmore's name appeared on almost every page. 3 anonymous complaints, Malcolm said, sliding one document toward Evelyn. All dismissed because there was not enough evidence. He placed another beside it. 2 unusual custody rulings involving the same court-appointed evaluator. Then another, and 1 clerk who resigned without notice 6 weeks ago. Evelyn looked from one page to the next. "None of this proves misconduct." "No," Malcolm agreed. "But patterns matter." He closed the folder again. "Honest mistakes happen once. Systems fail when the same mistakes begin helping the same people." Meanwhile, Nia finally forced herself toward the city bus stop 3 blocks away. Her apartment felt impossibly empty waiting for her, but she could not bear returning there yet. She sat beneath the small shelter as buses came and went, barely noticing the passing time. She unlocked her phone and stared at Elijah's school picture, taken only 4 months earlier. His smile had been missing 1 front tooth, and he had insisted on wearing the blue sweater she had found at a thrift store because, in his words, it made him look like an astronaut. Tears blurred the screen before she quickly wiped them away. She had promised him she would come back. She could not let the last thing he remembered be his mother crying. Her phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed the name of her supervisor at the nursing home. "Nia, we heard what happened," Mrs. Hernandez said gently after she answered. "You do not have to come in tonight if you need time." Nia looked toward the gray clouds gathering above downtown Columbus. Every part of her wanted to crawl beneath a blanket and disappear from the world for one day. Instead, she swallowed hard. "If I do not work, I cannot pay my rent," she replied softly. "And if I cannot pay my rent, they will say Elijah has no stable home to come back to." There was a brief pause before Mrs. Hernandez answered, her voice filled with quiet respect. "Then we will see you at 6. As the call ended, Nia stood, adjusted the backpack still hanging from her shoulder, and walked toward the arriving bus. She did not notice the black sedan easing into traffic several car lengths behind. Malcolm watched her board without saying a word. Most people who lost everything spent the next few hours blaming the judge, the lawyers, or fate itself. Nia Brooks had gone back to work. Malcolm rested one hand on the sealed folder in his lap. "She is stronger than the file says," he murmured. Evelyn looked out the window toward the departing bus, where someone made sure the file never told the whole story. Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly. "Find the clerk who resigned," he said. "I want to know why she disappeared exactly 3 days before today's hearing." Evelyn nodded and reached for her phone. Neither of them noticed that, inside the folder beneath Judge Whitmore's financial disclosures, a single receipt had slipped loose from its paperclip. It was dated 6 months earlier, issued by a consulting firm specializing in parental fitness evaluations, and across the bottom, almost hidden beneath a faded processing stamp, appeared a signature bearing a name Malcolm recognized immediately. Night settled over Columbus beneath a blanket of low clouds that reflected the city's amber streetlights, turning every rain-soaked sidewalk into a ribbon of muted gold. Inside Green Meadows Senior Care Center, the scent of fresh coffee mixed with antiseptic drifted quietly through the hallways as Nia Brooks adjusted a blanket over an elderly resident sleeping peacefully beside the window. Her movements remained gentle and practiced despite the exhaustion pressing behind her eyes. She smiled whenever a resident looked her way, answered every call light with patience, and carried herself exactly as she had the day before. Only the absence of the small voice that usually asked what she was bringing home for dinner made the silence unbearable. During her scheduled break, she slipped into the empty staff lounge and opened the plastic lunch container she had packed that morning. Inside sat a turkey sandwich cut neatly in half and a small bag of apple slices. She stared at the untouched food for several seconds before quietly sliding half of the sandwich back into the container. Habit was difficult to erase. For years, she had automatically saved the larger portion for Elijah. Her phone remained silent. No messages, no photographs, no updates. She knew the temporary custody order allowed Marcus to decide when she could speak with their son, and the realization settled over her heart with fresh weight. Across the city, the top floor of the Judicial Oversight and Ethics Commission remained brightly lit long after neighboring offices had gone dark. Malcolm Carter stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Columbus, while Evelyn Price spread documents across the conference table behind him. A digital clock on the wall displayed nearly 10 o'clock, yet neither of them showed any intention of leaving. Evelyn held up the faded receipt they had discovered earlier that afternoon. "The consulting company exists," she said, "but according to state records, they stopped providing family court evaluations almost 4 years ago." Malcolm turned from the window. "Then why were they billing someone 6 months ago?" Evelyn slid another folder across the table. "Because the payment did not come from the court." Malcolm opened it carefully. The invoice had been paid by a private account belonging to Hawthorne Family Consulting, the same organization responsible for evaluating Nia Brooks before the custody hearing. The evaluator's signature matched the signature on the receipt exactly. Malcolm studied the name without speaking. "Dr. Stephen Calloway," he said quietly. "He evaluated Nia." Evelyn nodded. "He also evaluated the mothers in 2 previous custody cases assigned to Judge Whitmore." Malcolm looked up. The same judge, the same evaluator, the same consulting connection. Evelyn folded her arms. It could still be coincidence. Malcolm closed the file gently. Coincidences rarely charge consulting fees after a company has closed. Meanwhile, several miles away, Marcus Brooks unlocked the front door of his suburban home. Elijah stepped inside carrying his blue backpack without saying a word. The house was larger than the apartment he had grown up in, with freshly painted walls and a backyard that backed onto a neighborhood park. Everything looked perfect. Marcus knelt beside his son with an encouraging smile. "You are going to like it here, buddy. There is a basketball hoop out back, and your room has a telescope." Elijah looked around politely before asking the only question that mattered to him. "Can I call Mom now?" Marcus hesitated for only a second. "Not tonight. Everyone needs a little time to settle in first." Elijah lowered his eyes. "She always says goodnight." Marcus placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Tomorrow." Elijah nodded because he had been taught to respect adults, but as he walked toward the bedroom prepared for him, he quietly unzipped his backpack and pulled out the small astronaut keychain that had broken loose during the hearing. He wrapped it tightly in his hand before climbing onto the unfamiliar bed. In his apartment across town, an empty twin bed sat untouched beneath glow-in-the-dark stars still clinging to the ceiling. Nia returned home just after 11 o'clock, placed Elijah's folded laundry inside the dresser exactly where it had always been, and straightened the framed drawing he had taped beside his bedroom door. It showed the two of them holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. Across the top, written in uneven block letters, were the words, "My mom always comes back." Nia traced the crayon letters with trembling fingertips before whispering into the quiet room, "I still will." At nearly the same moment, Malcolm's office telephone rang. Evelyn answered first, listened carefully, then slowly covered the receiver with one hand. "We found the former court clerk," she said. "She is willing to talk." Malcolm reached for his jacket. What changed her mind? Evelyn's expression grew unusually serious. "She says she kept copies of documents because one custody case never made sense to her." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Which case?" Evelyn looked directly at him. "Nia Brooks. She said there was one report that disappeared from the official court file the night before the hearing. The meeting took place just before sunrise in a small diner on the outskirts of Columbus where the coffee was strong. The booths were worn smooth from decades of conversations, and almost no one looked twice at strangers keeping to themselves. Malcolm Carter arrived first, choosing the corner table farthest from the windows. He removed his jacket, ordered black coffee, and quietly reviewed a legal pad filled with dates, case numbers, and handwritten notes while the first rays of morning struggled through heavy clouds. 5 minutes later, Evelyn Price walked in beside a woman in her early 50s whose shoulders remained tense even before she sat down. Linda Foster had spent 19 years as a courtroom clerk before resigning without notice 2 months earlier. She wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug the waitress placed before her, not because she was cold, but because it gave her trembling fingers somewhere to rest. "Thank you for coming," Malcolm said gently. Linda managed a small nod. "I almost did not." Evelyn remained silent, allowing Malcolm to guide the conversation at its own pace. He never believed frightened people revealed the truth by being pressured. They revealed it when they finally believed someone would listen. "You told my office there was a document removed from an official court file," Malcolm said calmly. Linda lowered her eyes toward the tabletop. "There were actually 2. Malcolm waited. She took a slow breath before continuing. "The first was corrected before the hearing. The second disappeared the night before." Malcolm leaned forward only slightly. "Tell me about the second." Linda glanced toward the diner entrance as though expecting someone to walk in. "It was an observation report from Elijah's elementary school counselor." Malcolm exchanged a brief look with Evelyn. "What did it say?" Linda swallowed carefully. "It said Elijah consistently described his mother as safe, attentive, and emotionally supportive. The counselor specifically wrote there were no observable signs that the child feared living with her." Malcolm remained completely still. "Was that report filed?" "Yes." "Then why was it missing?" Linda hesitated for several long seconds. "Because someone instructed me to replace the complete packet with an updated version." Malcolm's voice remained even. "Who gave the instruction?" Linda's answer came barely above a whisper. "Judge Whitmore's judicial assistant brought me the replacement file." Evelyn quietly wrote another note. Malcolm did not interrupt. Linda looked exhausted, as though every sentence cost more courage than the last. "Did anyone explain why the report had been removed?" Malcolm asked. She shook her head. "I asked if there had been a filing error. I was told the judge had received revised documentation." Malcolm folded his hands together. "Did you ever see revised documentation?" "No." Silence settled over the booth. Outside, delivery trucks rolled slowly past the diner while the city gradually awakened to another ordinary morning. Inside, nothing felt ordinary anymore. Malcolm finally asked the question that mattered most. "Why did you resign?" Linda's eyes filled with quiet regret. "Because that was not the only case." She reached into her handbag and carefully removed a plain manila envelope that had clearly been opened many times. "I started making copies whenever something felt wrong. I told myself it was only to protect my own job. Then one day I realized I was protecting evidence instead." Malcolm accepted the envelope with both hands as though it contained something fragile. Inside were photocopies of filing logs, internal routing sheets, and one page that immediately caught his attention. It showed every document officially received by the court before Nia's custody hearing. Malcolm's eyes slowly moved down the list until they stopped on a single entry highlighted in yellow marker. "School counselor assessment. Received. Processed. Included." Yet the version presented to the judge no longer listed it. Someone had deliberately altered the final file. Malcolm closed the envelope without saying a word. Across town, Nia finished another overnight shift before walking the familiar 6 blocks toward Elijah's school. Classes had not started yet, and children streamed through the front entrance carrying oversized backpacks and half-finished breakfasts. She remained across the street beneath an oak tree, careful not to step onto school property. She knew the temporary order discouraged unnecessary contact, and she refused to give anyone another reason to question her judgment. She only wanted to see that her son was smiling. A dark blue sport utility vehicle pulled into the drop-off lane. Marcus stepped out first before opening the passenger door. Elijah climbed onto the sidewalk carrying the same faded blue backpack. He looked toward the school entrance, then suddenly turned his head toward the opposite side of the street as though sensing something familiar. For one brief heartbeat, mother and son found each other across the morning traffic. Nia smiled and raised one hand no higher than her shoulder. Elijah's face lit up with relief, and he quickly lifted the tiny astronaut keychain hanging from his backpack before disappearing inside the building. Marcus never noticed the silent exchange. Nia stood there long after the school doors closed, drawing strength from a moment that had lasted less than 3 seconds. At almost the same time, Malcolm returned to his office and spread Linda's copied documents across the conference table. He compared every page against the official electronic court file. Most matched perfectly. One did not. The filing log listed an additional attachment that no longer existed anywhere in the digital archive. Malcolm slowly reached for the telephone. "Evelyn," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Do not request records through normal channels anymore." She looked up immediately. "Why?" Malcolm held up the altered filing log. "Because whoever removed that report had access to both the courtroom and the database. If we ask the wrong person for help now, they will know exactly what we have found." By Thursday afternoon, the investigation had reached a point where every new answer seemed to create 2 new questions. Malcolm Carter stood alone inside the secure records room of the Judicial Oversight and Ethics Commission, surrounded by shelves lined with sealed case files that represented years of public trust. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above him as he compared printed filing logs with encrypted archive records 1 page at a time. Most cases were exactly as they should have been. Dates matched. Signatures matched. Digital timestamps matched. Nia Brooks's case remained the single exception. The electronic archive showed that one attachment had been deleted at 11:37 the night before the custody hearing. Yet the security log claimed no employee had accessed the database during that period. Malcolm had spent enough years auditing judicial systems to recognize an impossible record when he saw one. Computers did not erase files by themselves. Someone had logged in under another person's credentials or manipulated the audit trail itself. Evelyn Price entered carrying another folder and quietly closed the door behind her. "The technology department confirmed something unusual," she said. "The deletion did not happen from inside the courthouse." Malcolm looked up immediately. "Where?" Evelyn placed a printed report on the table. "A remote connection using an authorized judicial account." Malcolm studied the address listed on the page. It originated from a private office building less than 2 miles from the courthouse, a location occupied by several consulting firms, including Hawthorne Family Consulting. He slowly exhaled. "The same company linked to Dr. Stephen Calloway." Evelyn nodded. "Someone outside the courthouse accessed an internal court file." Malcolm remained silent for several moments. That single fact transformed suspicion into something much more serious. If accurate, it meant the custody hearing had relied on a file altered before the judge ever entered the courtroom. Meanwhile, Nia finished another long shift before stopping at the small neighborhood grocery store where she had shopped every Friday for years. She pushed an almost empty cart through the narrow aisles, carefully comparing prices exactly as she always had. Even with Elijah temporarily living elsewhere, she still reached automatically for his favorite cereal before quietly placing it back on the shelf. Old habits did not disappear simply because a court order demanded they should. As she approached the checkout counter, the cashier smiled gently. "Your little guy is not with you today?" Nia forced a warm smile that barely reached her tired eyes. "Not today." The cashier nodded politely, sensing enough pain not to ask another question. Nia paid for milk, bread, eggs, and a bag of apples before walking toward the parking lot beneath another gray Ohio sky. Just as she unlocked her aging sedan, She noticed a plain white envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper. There was no stamp, no return address, only her name, written neatly across the front in black ink. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked around the nearly empty parking lot, but no one seemed to be watching. Slowly, she opened the envelope. Inside rested a single photocopied receipt from Hawthorne Family Consulting. One line had been highlighted in yellow. Expedited parental assessment revision. Processing fee paid in full. The date matched exactly 3 days before her custody hearing. On the back, someone had handwritten only 6 words. Follow the money. Trust the evidence. Nia stared at the page in confusion. She had never requested any revised assessment. She had never even heard that phrase before. Yet something deep inside her told her not to throw the paper away. She folded it carefully and slipped it into her purse. Across town, Malcolm stood at the large window of his office watching evening traffic crawl through downtown Columbus. "Did you send it?" Evelyn asked quietly from behind him. Malcolm gave a slight nod. She deserves to know there are questions without telling her there is an investigation. Evelyn hesitated. If someone is watching her, Malcolm finished the thought, then they will assume the receipt frightens her instead of helping her. He turned back toward the conference table where every copied document remained carefully organized. Sometimes people reveal themselves when they believe they are still winning. Before Evelyn could answer, Malcolm's private telephone rang. Very few people possessed that number. He answered calmly. "Carter." A familiar voice spoke from the other end, unusually nervous. It belonged to one of the commission's senior forensic analysts. "Sir, I think you need to come downstairs." Malcolm immediately recognized the urgency. "What happened?" There was a brief silence before the analyst replied. "We recovered part of the deleted school counselor report from the backup server." Malcolm's expression hardened with cautious hope. "That is good news." "It would be," the analyst answered quietly. "Except the restored copy contains a digital approval signature that should not exist." According to the timestamp, Judge Whitmore approved the altered version almost 8 hours before the original report was ever removed. "Sir, the timeline is impossible. The restored file should have been the breakthrough that changed everything." Yet by sunrise it had become the greatest obstacle Malcolm Carter had faced in years. Inside the commission's digital forensics laboratory, 3 analysts sat before glowing monitors comparing encrypted records line by line, while the quiet hum of cooling fans filled the room. Every verification produced the same impossible result. The altered school counselor report carried a judicial approval timestamp, recorded 8 hours before the original report had supposedly been removed. It was like finding tomorrow's newspaper printed yesterday. Malcolm stood behind the analysts with his hands folded, watching the evidence unfold without speaking. Finally, the senior forensic analyst leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. Either someone manipulated 2 separate secure systems with extraordinary precision, he said quietly, or the metadata itself was rewritten before the custody hearing even took place. Malcolm understood exactly what that meant. This was no longer a simple missing document. Whoever had orchestrated the changes understood the court's filing process well enough to hide their tracks inside the system itself. Evelyn Price entered carrying fresh coffee, but one look at Malcolm's face told her the news was worse than expected. "Tell me," she said. Malcolm placed the recovered report beside the official version presented in court. The differences were subtle but devastating. The genuine report described Elijah as emotionally secure with his mother, consistently clean, well cared for, and strongly attached to her. The altered version replaced those observations with vague concerns about instability and inconsistent supervision. No dramatic accusations, just enough uncertainty to influence a custody decision. Evelyn slowly turned another page. "Someone did not invent a different story," she whispered. "They only changed a few sentences." Malcolm nodded. "The most dangerous lies are the ones built from pieces of the truth." Before either of them spoke again, the forensic analyst approached carrying another printed report. His expression had lost every trace of optimism. "Sir, we searched the backup server for the original upload source." Malcolm looked up. "And it is gone." Malcolm frowned. "Gone. Completely overwritten overnight." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. "Someone accessed the backups?" The analyst nodded. "Whoever is doing this realized we were looking." Silence settled heavily across the room. Malcolm had deliberately limited knowledge of the investigation to only a handful of trusted people. Yet somehow someone already knew exactly where the evidence was being examined. Across town, Nia sat alone in her apartment at the small kitchen table where Elijah usually finished his homework while eating apple slices after school. The grocery receipt and a mysterious consulting invoice rested beside an unopened cup of tea that had long since grown cold. She searched the internet for Hawthorne Family Consulting, reading every public record she could find. Most of the company website had been removed months earlier, but one archived page still listed family evaluations, legal consultations, and court support services. None of it explained why someone had paid for an expedited revision connected to her case. Her phone suddenly rang. The caller identification displayed Marcus Brooks. She answered immediately. "Can I talk to Elijah?" There was a short pause before Marcus replied. "He is at soccer practice." Relief briefly softened her face. At least Elijah was smiling somewhere. "How is he doing?" she asked quietly. Marcus hesitated before answering. "He misses you." Nia closed her eyes for just a moment. "I miss him too." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Marcus sighed. "Nia, I know you think I wanted to hurt you. Did you?" she asked gently. Marcus did not answer directly. "I believed I was doing what was best for him." The sentence lingered between them with uncomfortable honesty. Nia realized something she had refused to consider before. Marcus did not sound victorious. He sounded conflicted. Before she could respond, he added quietly, "He still asks if you keep the porch light on at night." Tears filled her eyes despite every effort to remain composed. Tell him I always will." The call ended, leaving her staring silently through the kitchen window. Meanwhile, Malcolm returned to his office carrying the recovered documents. As he reached his desk, he noticed a sealed envelope waiting in the center of the polished wood surface. No assistant had mentioned a delivery. No courier had signed the visitor log. Inside rested a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed across the middle in plain black letters. "Stop looking into the Brooks case before innocent people lose more than custody." Malcolm read the message twice before folding it neatly and placing it beside the altered report. Evelyn entered moments later and immediately noticed his expression. "What is it?" she asked. Malcolm handed her the anonymous warning without saying a word. She read it slowly, then looked back at him. "Someone is trying to intimidate you." Malcolm calmly picked up his coat. "No," he replied. "Someone is afraid." He walked toward the office door before stopping with one hand on the handle. And frightened people usually make mistakes. At that exact moment, hundreds of miles away inside an off-site digital storage facility contracted by the state, an automated system completed its nightly synchronization. Hidden among millions of archived files, one forgotten backup that no one had requested to restore quietly finished copying itself onto a protected server, preserving a version of Nia Brooks's original court file that no one yet knew still existed. Monday morning arrived with clear skies for the first time in nearly a week, but the sunlight did little to ease the growing pressure inside the offices of the Judicial Oversight and Ethics Commission. Malcolm Carter entered the executive conference room, carrying only one black folder. Around the long walnut table sat the commission's 5 senior board members, each with decades of experience protecting the integrity of Ohio's judicial system. Normally, formal investigations required unanimous patience and careful procedure. Today, Malcolm intended to ask for something much riskier. He placed the anonymous warning letter beside the altered court records and looked around the room before speaking. "Someone manipulated evidence presented during a child custody hearing," he said calmly. "Someone also gained unauthorized access to court records, altered digital archives, and attempted to interfere with this investigation." One board member, retired Judge Eleanor Pierce, folded her hands thoughtfully. "Do you have enough evidence to identify the responsible party?" Malcolm answered with complete honesty. "Not yet." Another member leaned forward. "Then why are we meeting?" Malcolm rested both hands lightly on the table. "Because whoever is responsible now knows we are getting close." The room remained silent. Finally, Judge Pierce spoke again. "You are asking permission to expand this inquiry beyond administrative review." Malcolm nodded once. "I am asking permission to convene a special ethics panel with independent forensic authority." Several members exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone in the room understood the consequences. Such a panel would trigger public scrutiny, attract media attention, and inevitably place respected judges under investigation. It had not happened in more than a decade. One commissioner looked directly at Malcolm. "You know, this will not only place Judge Whitmore under review. It will place your own office under review as well." Malcolm did not hesitate. "If public trust requires my decisions to be examined too, then so be it." Judge Pierce studied him carefully before asking one final question. "And if this investigation ends your career?" Malcolm's answer came quietly. "A position exists to protect the system, not the person holding it." Across town, Nia walked into the legal aid office carrying a folder so worn the edges had begun to curl. She had spent every free hour gathering pay stubs, attendance records, school certificates, medical receipts, and handwritten notes documenting nearly every day of Elijah's life. The volunteer attorney assigned to review her file, Angela Morris, welcomed her into a small office lined with overflowing bookshelves. Angela carefully examined each document while Nia waited nervously across the desk. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the attorney finally looked up. "You kept everything," Angela said with genuine surprise. Nia gave a small nod. "My grandmother always said that memories comfort people, but records protect them." Angela smiled faintly before her expression became more serious. "These documents tell a very different story than the court summary I reviewed last week." Hope flickered briefly inside Nia's tired eyes. "Does that mean we can appeal?" Angela hesitated. "Not yet." The single sentence drained the hope almost as quickly as it had appeared. Angela gently pushed the file back across the desk. "Your records prove you worked hard for your son. They prove you loved him. But to reopen a custody order this quickly, we must prove the court relied on incomplete or inaccurate information. We still need evidence from inside the judicial process." Nia lowered her eyes. Once again, the truth seemed to exist without being enough. At almost the same moment, Elijah sat quietly in his second-grade classroom coloring a picture of the solar system. His teacher stopped beside his desk and smiled. "That is beautiful, Elijah." He looked up proudly. "My mom says astronauts never stop looking for the way home." The teacher noticed he had drawn two people standing beneath the stars instead of one. She gently asked, "Who is beside the astronaut?" Elijah answered without looking away from his drawing. "My mom. She always finds me." Meanwhile, the commission meeting reached its conclusion. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, Judge Pierce slowly signed the authorization document and passed it across the table. One by one, the remaining board members added their signatures until the final approval rested before Malcolm. The special ethics panel was officially authorized. Evelyn Price quietly released a breath she had been holding throughout the meeting. As everyone prepared to leave, Malcolm gathered the signed papers into his folder. Before he reached the door, Judge Pierce called after him. "Malcolm," he turned. "From this moment forward, every decision you make will be examined publicly. Friends may become witnesses. Colleagues may become suspects. You cannot protect both your reputation and the truth." Malcolm met her steady gaze without hesitation. "I stopped trying to protect my reputation the moment I read that child's file." Later that afternoon, as Evelyn organized the newly authorized investigation, her secure telephone rang. The call came from the State Archive Division. She listened silently for nearly a minute before standing so abruptly that her chair rolled backward across the floor. She hurried into Malcolm's office, her voice trembling with cautious excitement. "The automated storage facility completed its weekly synchronization last night," she said. "An untouched backup copy of the Brooks case has been located." Malcolm rose immediately. "Is it complete?" Evelyn nodded. "Completely untouched. It was archived before any later revisions were made." Malcolm reached for his jacket, but Evelyn raised one hand. "There is one more thing." Malcolm stopped. "What?" Evelyn looked directly into his eyes. According to the archive log, the original file was accessed exactly once after it was stored. Malcolm's expression sharpened. "By whom?" Evelyn slowly turned the monitor toward him. Displayed on the screen was the authenticated user identification of the person who had opened the untouched archive weeks before the custody hearing. The name was not Judge Harold Whitmore. It was Marcus Brooks. The revelation hung in Malcolm Carter's office with a weight that neither he nor Evelyn Price could ignore. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the quiet hum of the computer displaying the archive log. Marcus Brooks's authenticated credentials had accessed the preserved court file nearly 3 weeks before the custody hearing. Yet the archive itself remained unchanged. Malcolm studied the screen again before speaking. He opened the file, he said quietly. But he did not alter it. Evelyn looked surprised. How can you be certain? Malcolm pointed to the audit sequence. The archive is read-only. He could view it, print it, or copy it, but he could not edit it. Evelyn's eyes narrowed as she followed the timeline. Then why would he access the original version? Malcolm leaned back slowly. That is exactly the question we need answered. Less than 24 hours later, Marcus received an official request to appear before the newly authorized Special Ethics Panel. He arrived carrying a slim folder and wearing the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the custody proceedings. He seemed surprised to find Malcolm waiting inside the conference room rather than a courtroom. There were no television cameras, no jury, and no dramatic speeches. Only a long wooden table, several independent investigators, and a digital recorder quietly documenting every word. Malcolm greeted him politely before sliding a single page across the table. Can you explain why you accessed the archived court file on this date? Marcus lowered his eyes to the document. The color slowly faded from his face. He remained silent long enough for everyone in the room to notice. Finally, he looked back up. Because I thought someone had changed it. Evelyn exchanged a quick glance with Malcolm, but neither interrupted. Marcus folded his hands together as though organizing thoughts he had carried alone for weeks. The report Dr. Calloway discussed with my attorney did not sound like the school counselor I met during Elijah's conferences. He paused before continuing. She always spoke highly of Nia. Malcolm watched him carefully. Then why did you continue with the custody hearing? Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Because my attorney told me the revised report had come directly from the court, and that questioning it would only delay everything. He gave a tired shake of his head. I convinced myself the professionals knew more than I did. Malcolm asked the next question gently. Why access the archived file? Marcus reached into his folder and carefully removed a folded sheet of paper. Because after the hearing, Elijah kept insisting the counselor liked his mother. He repeated it so many times that I stopped sleeping. He slid the paper across the table. I used an old employee contact at the archive division to compare the preserved file with the version used in court. Malcolm unfolded the page. It contained handwritten notes listing every difference Marcus had personally discovered between the original and revised documents. He had circled 3 altered sentences in red ink. Why did you never report this? Malcolm asked quietly. Marcus's voice almost disappeared. Because by the time I realized something was wrong, I was afraid everyone would believe I helped create it. The room fell silent again. Malcolm looked at the notes before him, then at the man sitting across the table. For the first time since the investigation began, he no longer saw a father trying to win. He saw a father struggling to live with a decision he no longer trusted. Later that afternoon, Nia received an unexpected telephone call from Angela Morris. The attorney's voice carried an excitement Nia had never heard before. The Special Ethics Panel has requested every document connected to your case, Angela said, including evidence that was never presented during your hearing. Nia sat down slowly at her kitchen table. Does that mean? Angela answered carefully. It means the system is asking whether it made a mistake. Tears filled Nia's eyes, but this time they were different. They were not tears of surrender. They were the quiet release that came when hope, after disappearing for so long, finally found its way home. That evening, Malcolm stood alone outside the commission building as the sun dipped below the Columbus skyline. Evelyn joined him carrying a fresh copy of the investigation summary. Marcus was telling the truth, she said. His notes matched the restored archive exactly. Malcolm nodded. Then he is no longer only a party to the case. Evelyn understood immediately. He is a witness. Malcolm looked toward the courthouse rising above the city streets in the fading light. Tomorrow we stop asking who benefited from the altered evidence. He paused before finishing the thought. Tomorrow we ask who believed no one would ever compare the original file with the truth. The special hearing began on a quiet Friday morning beneath the same stone columns where Nia Brooks had once stood believing she had lost everything. This time, however, the atmosphere inside the courthouse felt different. There were no television cameras crowding the entrance and no shouting reporters waiting outside. Only attorneys, court employees, and members of the Special Ethics Panel moved through the hallways with measured purpose. The hearing was not convened to determine whether Nia loved her son. That question had quietly answered itself long ago. It was convened to determine whether the judicial process that separated them had been worthy of the trust placed in it. Nia sat beside Angela Morris with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across the room, Marcus Brooks occupied another table alone. He had dismissed his previous attorney several days earlier and had voluntarily submitted every email, invoice, and communication connected to the original custody proceedings. When their eyes briefly met, neither parent looked away. There was sadness between them, but no hatred. Both had come to understand that the truth had become larger than either one of them. Malcolm Carter remained seated with the members of the oversight panel rather than at either attorney's table. His role was not to argue for one parent or the other. His responsibility was to present the investigation exactly as the evidence supported it. One by one, the findings were introduced. Linda Foster testified that an official filing had been replaced before the original hearing. Digital forensic specialists demonstrated the altered timestamps that could not have occurred naturally within the court system. The restored archive revealed the original school counselor report praising the stable and loving relationship between Elijah and his mother. Financial records established that an expedited assessment revision had been requested through Hawthorne Family Consulting shortly before the hearing. Finally, Marcus quietly described why he had accessed the archived file after realizing Elijah's repeated memories did not match the version presented in court. He admitted that he had trusted professionals instead of asking difficult questions, a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. Judge Harold Whitmore listened carefully throughout the proceedings before speaking for the first time. His voice carried neither defensiveness nor anger, only visible disappointment. The evidence presented today demonstrates that the court relied upon incomplete and improperly altered materials. Whether those alterations reached this courtroom intentionally or through failures in procedure, the result remains the same. The integrity of this custody determination cannot stand. A quiet stillness settled across the courtroom. Nia lowered her head as tears slipped silently onto folded hands that had worked countless overnight shifts, signed endless forms, and refused to surrender even when hope seemed impossible. The judge continued. The previous custody order is hereby vacated. Temporary primary custody is restored to Nia Brooks while a new evaluation proceeds using verified evidence under independent supervision. Nia closed her eyes for only a moment, almost afraid she had imagined the words. Then she heard another familiar sound. Mom. Elijah stood near the courtroom entrance holding the blue backpack that had traveled with him through every uncertain day since the first hearing. Before anyone spoke again, he ran across the room and wrapped both arms around his mother exactly as he had on the day they were separated. This time no one asked him to let go. Nia held him close, her shoulders trembling as months of fear quietly gave way to relief. I told you I would come back, she whispered through grateful tears. Elijah smiled against her shoulder. I knew you would. Marcus approached slowly before stopping a respectful distance away. His eyes rested on his son for several seconds before turning toward Nia. I am sorry, he said simply. I should have trusted what Elijah kept trying to tell me. Nia looked at him with the calm that only difficult journeys sometimes create. Then let us both start listening to him now. Marcus nodded, understanding that healing would require honesty from everyone, including himself. Nearly 1 year later, the old courtroom looked remarkably similar, yet everything inside it had changed. Nia no longer entered as a frightened mother carrying the weight of uncertainty alone. She walked beside another single parent seeking legal guidance through a volunteer family advocacy program she had helped establish with local attorneys and community organizations. Malcolm Carter had quietly arranged funding for the program through a judicial education foundation without attaching his name to a single brochure or building. As another hearing concluded, Nia stepped outside into warm spring sunshine, where Elijah waited on the courthouse steps wearing the same astronaut keychain clipped proudly to a brand new backpack. He raced toward her with the easy confidence of a child who no longer questioned where home was. Malcolm stood across the plaza preparing to leave when Elijah waved enthusiastically. Malcolm returned the wave with a quiet smile before turning toward the city street. As he walked away, he glanced once at the courthouse behind him. The law had separated a family in less than 5 minutes. It had taken many honest people, difficult choices, and unwavering courage to make that family whole again. Yet perhaps that was the true purpose of justice. Not merely correcting mistakes after they happened, but reminding ordinary people that truth, though sometimes delayed, still finds its way home.